It's great to be able to talk to you on this subject of Come Follow Me, and in this particular instance I'll be taking an interpretation on that looks at giving and looks at generosity. Now, I remember when I was part of an Eden team about 20 years ago, I was living in a house and I had a housemate who, let's say, had been more than a little bit irresponsible with our bills. Left me with a really big bill. It was stressing me out. I didn't have any means to pay it. I was embarrassed about it. And out of the blue, I got a phone call. And it was somebody I knew only tenuously, more of a friend of my parents than a personal friend. But I'm pretty sure I hadn't told my parents about the situation that was going on. Anyway, this guy said to me, he said, "Look, Matt, I've been praying and I really feel that God wants me to give you some money." And I was like, "Wow, that's amazing. Just thank you so much." And he said, "I want to give you £500. And that really blew me away, not just because 20 years ago, £500 was a heck of a lot of money to me. I mean, it still is today, but then it was like a massive amount of money. But it was almost to the penny the amount of money that was necessary to pay this bill that I owed. Well, not that I owed, but that I'd been left with by my housemate. And it really, really moved me. It really got to me. And I think it really was formational in shifting something in me in terms of my attitude towards giving, towards receiving, and towards being a generous person. But it also, really reassured me as well, as you might imagine, that, my needs were seen by God, and in a very sort of practical way. He was interested in saving me. Not just in a sort of a spiritualized way, sort of saving my soul, but actually of redeeming the aspects of my life that were sort of tangled up in the fallenness of the world. And that was something that he could do something about. So I want to begin there, because what we're going to deal with over the next 20 minutes, 25 minutes begins with that recognition that if we want to be remotely serious about being a Christ follower, then generosity and giving are not just optional extras that are added into that, but actually our attitude towards money and possessions and what we do with them is absolutely central to what it means to be a Christ follower. And it's been part of the story that has been unfolding throughout time, actually. It's always been not only a spiritual/religious story, but it's also been a kind of an economic/political story. You see, there is a system that we're born into. It's an economic system. You might say it's a system in which we live and move and have our being. And it's a system from which it's kind of a pattern that we're conformed to, that we have to be somehow renewed in our mind to discover a way out of. And I want to begin then just with one verse which comes from Matthew chapter 10, and this is words directly from the mouth of Jesus. He said, "Freely you have received, freely give." And I want to take that as the starting point for what I want to talk to you about in the next few minutes, but also it will be the kind of the golden thread through everything that I'm going to say. Freely you've received, freely give is kind of the opposite of that phrase that we sometimes use these days, which is in one hand and out the other, which we kind of use as a negative phrase. But actually what Jesus is saying is that's a positive thing. If we allow God's good gifts to flow through us in one hand and out of the other, then actually that's exactly the way that Jesus wants us to live. So, over the next 20 minutes or so, I want to summarize for you what the Bible gives us in terms of narrating this story to us. And I want to arrive at some practical ways that you can revolutionize your giving. But in order to get there first, and where I want us to get to is the idea of something called common funds. And I'll unpack that later. It's an idea from the early church, but I do believe it's an ancient practice that we can rediscover today in terms of deepening our discipleship and blessing our communities. But I think before we get there, we've got to lay some foundations first of all, and that's going to involve going way, way, way back. So we're going to do a bit of a whirlwind tour through the Bible, and then we're going to arrive at New Testament, early church, common funds, and the way I think we can rediscover those for today. So I guess I would subtitle this first half of this talk, How Not to Be the Empire. Because one of the first things we need to see is that one of the big themes of the Bible in a sense represents for us a cautionary tale of how not to be the empire. And it does that initially through the story of Israel. Let me explain that. If we begin then, the first few pages of the Bible, we've got the creation accounts, the poetry and the prose that form for us that great introduction to the scriptures, the things that tell us that we're not here by accident, but we're here by God's intent and design and power and purpose. And that's how life arrived. That doesn't necessarily mean life didn't evolve. It just means that God was central and making that process happen. So the thing that we notice when we read those first few pages is that the world was full of abundance. There was more than enough. There was no sense that those first human communities had any lack. Everything was provided. We're given these great pictures of the seas teeming with fish, the sky teeming with birds, the land just being full of fruitfulness. And that's where the story begins. But very quickly, that story goes sour. By the end of the book of Genesis, we've moved on and we are located in a place of scarcity. And that place has a name, and that name is Egypt. And at the heart of that story, we've got some characters. We've got the boss of that place, who's called Pharaoh, and we've got a character who's been introduced called Joseph. We tend to think of him as the hero of the story, but actually if you look closely, if you pay attention, particularly at Genesis chapter 47, read that sort of line by line and see what's actually taking place there, you'll see that Joseph is actually a bit of a villain, as he uses the conditions of famine to extort all of the ancestrally owned farmlands from out underneath the ordinary Egyptians. The former chief rabbi, Jonathan Sachs, puts it like this: that the result of Joseph's policies were that unprecedented wealth and power were concentrated in Pharaoh's hand, power that would eventually be used against the Israelites. And so what we see there is that it's essentially a pyramid economy. Never has that phrase been more appropriate. And on top of that pyramid, that economic structure that funnels upwards, at the top of that pyramid is Pharaoh. And it's one giant scheme to accumulate wealth towards himself. Now, as we turn the page into Exodus, God's chosen people are under this burden of slavery. That particular Pharaoh has passed away, so has Joseph. There's a new Pharaoh in town, even more ruthless than the last one. But God hears the cry of his people in Egypt. That's the plot line. And then this story of liberation begins to unfold. And Moses arises as this leader called by God, leads the people out of Egypt, but not immediately back into a place of abundance. Actually, they're still in a place of scarcity. They're in the desert. They don't have enough water. They don't have enough to eat. But this wilderness place is the place where God has determined that their new identity is going to be formed. And their identity is essentially to be the not Egypt people. Everything that defined them before, all that they brought with them in terms of mindset from Egypt, needed to be revolutionized in order for them to enter their new identity and the new land that God had assigned for them. And essentially, it's a process of learning to trust and to obey. Trust is developed through the provision of water and of food. This mysterious food called manna, and also these sort of birds that arrive called quail. Interestingly, the obedience is developed through the introduction of a legal code, but the two are not separate. And if you look, I think it's around about Exodus 15:16 is where all this is happening. You see that as the manna falls on the ground, with it are instructions. And it's a way of ensuring that the people don't bring their Egypt mindset into their new reality of the provision that God is making available for them. It's this strict set of criteria around how much they can collect on what day of the week. And critically, this is where the Sabbath rest is instituted, which pretty much like all the law set out in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, can only really be properly understood by way of contrast with Egypt, because this covenant economy that those books begin to describe for us, full of wonderful innovations like tithe feasts and jubilee, is essentially how Israel is going to define itself as the not Egypt people. So, as we continue to follow the Bible's storyline, we see that Israel does a poor job of being the not Egypt people. Against the advice of that great prophet Samuel, they decide they want to establish a monarchy anyway, to be like the people around them. And within a couple of generations, we've got Solomon on the throne. Solomon is another one of these characters who we generally uphold as a hero, but actually, upon closer inspection, is a bit of a villain. He married into the Egyptian dynasty, married one of Pharaoh's daughters, and in terms of his policies that he enacted as the leader and ruler of the nation, well, that involved, building up a huge military, which was against the advice of the prophets who told him not to put his trust in horses and chariots. He enslaves his own people. We see that if we begin to read the Bible closely, that actually there was not a just economy. And Walter Brueggemann, a great Old Testament scholar, likens Solomon to a bit of a King Midas. He seemed to have a bit of an unhealthy relationship with gold. And so he sets this template for royal privilege that on his death quickly splits the kingdom and sets in train a series of events that eventually, down the generations, lead to a moral descent that ends in the exile of the people into foreign lands. Now, it's actually on the return from exile that we get a glimpse of one of the most important political and economic turning points in the whole history of Israel, and it's found in the book of Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah's returned to begin building up Jerusalem. He's heartbroken about the state of the city, and he starts a physical reconstruction project, rebuilding the walls. We've all heard lots of sermons about rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem and taken all kinds of object lessons for them. We very rarely recognize what's happening in Nehemiah chapter 5, which is probably the most significant portion of the book of Nehemiah. And it could also be read as almost a sort of a repeat of Genesis chapter 47, because the people are taking the difficult economic conditions in which the book of Nehemiah is set. They're building the wall and it's this physical reconstruction, but everything's not booming. It's not like there's a sort of a big uptick in the economy at that time. Actually, there's a lot of scarcity around. They're trying to kind of kickstart the farms and get things going again. And some of the people are using debt as a lever to gain the title to other people's lands, and even enslaving their children of the families who owe them money. Now, Nehemiah eventually comes to see this. It's brought to his attention, and he's incredibly angry about it, and he takes really decisive action, and he essentially restores the principles of that old covenant economy, which we get in those early books of the Torah in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And he resets the economy according to those Jubilee principles so that the community will be at peace with itself internally, which is just as important as having walls that will protect it from external threat. So here we are. We'll turn now, we'll flick into the New Testament, and we continue the same themes, but recast in a new light. Our trust is still required, but it's refounded based on the cross and the resurrection. And our obedience is still expected, but it's renewed as the law of the Spirit rather than the written code. But in the same way that we can't really understand those books in the Old Testament without reference to Egypt, it's difficult to really grasp what's going on in the New Testament without seeing that long shadow of Rome being cast upon everything. And that goes right through from the Gospels, all the way through all the books of the teaching and the apostles and the letters, right through to Revelation. Rome looms large in the background. And so essentially the church is positioned in the New Testament as the not Rome people. Because, as Tom Wright is fond of saying, if Jesus is Lord, then Caesar cannot be. So we've circled back round to where we began. I want to bring in those words that I opened with, those words of Jesus found in Matthew 10. Freely you have received, freely give. And I want to add to them a couple of words from the book of John. I know that for the Eden Network, John 1:14 is a key text about the word becoming flesh and moving into the neighbourhood. Add to that John 1 verse 16, just a couple of lines later, where it says that from his abundance we've received one blessing after another, grace upon grace. And over in the New Testament we're reminded of our status as receivers of God's undeserved and unearned favour. Our posture towards God is as receivers. Now, I don't want to get into a whole lot of teaching around that, and there's so many places in the New Testament where there are references to receiving all kinds of good things from the hands of God. But I just want to go into the Gospels and into one of the parables that Jesus told. And it's a story with economics and money at its heart, and it's commonly known as the prodigal son. You'll be so familiar with it that I'm not going to dwell on it in any detail. I'm just going to skim the surface and then focus in on a detail that we often miss. But just to go over the basics again. So here's this son, this young man, and he essentially asks his father to liquidate the assets so that he can have his share, his half of the inheritance first. And then we know he goes off to whatever the equivalent of Ibiza or Las Vegas was, and he blows that on, I think, what the Bible very politely describes as wild living. Comes to his senses, decides he's going to return home, and is welcomed generously by his father, who throws a party for him. What's happened here is that early in that story, this son has essentially taken a look at this jar, which has got a label on it that says ours. And he's wanted to empty that jar into his own jar and take half of that jar that said ours and put it into a jar called mine and take away his jar of mine. And in doing that, in reducing what was ours into what is mine, all it's left him with is poverty and loneliness and heartbreak. And I think there's a really big lesson for us there. But the lesson I want us to really point towards is found in the dialogue between the older son and the father right at the very end. It's almost a little footnote at the end of the story. We know the elder son was a bit upset about his kid brother coming home, has a conversation with his father about that. And this is the line that the father gives him. Luke 15 verse 31, he says, "Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours." And here's the thing. Where close relational proximity exists, the idea of exclusive ownership of mine and yours evaporates. There is no mine. There is no yours. There is simply ours. And this then, I believe, is the foundation on which the first church in Jerusalem was established. The Bible tells us in the book of Acts that they held everything in common, and that included a common financial pot. It was initially administrated by the apostles, and then we hear in Acts chapter 6 it was delegated to a bunch of responsible people, Spirit-filled people who could ensure that it was more effectively distributed. And it was incredibly radical, even if on the evidence of the New Testament it was probably quite short-lived. When we see other churches being planted in other places, they don't necessarily seem to have had this sort of radical commune at their heart, although that doesn't mean, and it certainly doesn't undermine, that they nonetheless had, a radical generosity at their heart, and it doesn't make it any less valuable to us as a lesson. And I think it's this general principle of sharing that we know was definitely at the heart of all those early church communities. That's why Paul can say when he's writing to the Thessalonians, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. This ethos of sharing penetrated all aspects of life, including their economic life. And we know the way. In fact, Paul goes on to say in that very book, you know how we lived amongst you. We know he was a tent maker because he didn't want to be a drag on the finances of the poor amongst whom he lived. So on this foundation, the church can be a place in which everyone can enjoy their individuality, express their gifts, without descending into the dog-eat-dog world of individualism. Individualism has no place in Christian community. Individuality, we can all be ourselves, we can all be different, but within a oneness and a unity that recognizes we're part of something bigger than ourselves. And this then is the basis of our generosity and of our giving. Now, I know that the keynote speaker at your conference this year is Shane Claiborne, and I'm really sorry that we can't all be there together. It would be lovely to see Shane again. I first met Shane when I was leading the network about 15 years ago, and somewhere around here, in fact it might even be in my desk drawer, I've still got it, he gave me a dollar bill with the word love on it and told me some crazy stories about having parties in the open air on Wall Street where they threw around thousands of dollars in loose change while some old nun was blowing a ram's horn and declaring the Jubilee over New York City. And it was the first time I think I'd ever kind of come to conceive of the possibility that the kingdom of God could be something economic as well as something spiritual. And through Shane, I was introduced to one of his friends called Darren. Darren accompanied him on his visits here, events that we did as the network. I went over there and stayed with Darren and his family and in their neighborhood in Philadelphia, and discovered that off the back of their crazy Jubilee antics on Wall Street, they'd actually put an organization together that helped them to develop more of a day-to-day pattern of generosity in their lives. And that organization is called Common Change. And somehow I kind of accidentally became the chair of trustees of Common Change UK. And really, Common Change is the outworking of these principles of generosity and justice and giving, really based on the principle that giving at its heart is not something individualistic, but is something that we do together as a community. And Common Change allows groups of people, particularly people who have fallen themselves together with a shared vision and mission like Eden Teams, gives some infrastructure and some inspiration to allow groups to form their own common fund. Now it's up to you how much you put in that common fund, whether you make that some kind of percentage and you decide amongst yourselves we're all going to put kind of 1% of our disposable income into it, or 2%, or give yourself a range. They will put in between £10 a month and £100 a month or whatever. It's entirely up to you. You make your own rules. But once you've made those rules, you hold yourself accountable to them, and it becomes part of the lifestyle of your community. And as you meet and as you eat and as you talk, suddenly you become much more open and transparent about giving and about finance, because you've got a common pot. Now, like I say, the common fund that the church in Jerusalem first expressed doesn't seem to have been sustainable over the long term, and we don't really know what the reasons for that might have been. But the idea of having a common fund together is that we can live into that beautiful heritage and tradition. We can keep that alive amongst us, but in a sustainable way, by putting the right amount, hopefully, a sacrificial amount, into this fund that we then use, and we have discussions and make decisions together about how we're going to distribute that. I get the privilege as being chair of trustees to sort of rubber stamp all the requests that come through, and sort of week in, week out, month in, month out, there's sort of hundreds and thousands of pounds worth of gifts that are being distributed. I mean, just this morning I signed up for gift, sending some children's play equipment to a safe house locally here for people who've been rescued out of trafficking. A gazillion, all sorts of things that we've done. Not we've done, that groups have done that are made possible. There's often really, really practical things, helping people to pay a bill that's overdue, helping people to pay funeral expenses for somebody who's passed away, helping to cover somebody's expenses so that they can kind of travel to work and back again. Whatever it is that kind of fires your imagination, you can use your common fund to meet those needs. And we have this little app that you can put on your phone as well, just to make it really easy there's a kind of a voting process that goes along with that. And we have special meals, we call them generosity dinners, just to give us a bit of time and space to talk about distributing our common funds in a kind of more structured way. So, the researchers, it's not only Christians who do this, bizarrely. There are other people out there, they call it collective giving and giving circles. It's just a really energizing way to be generous and to be involved in giving, because actually it feels like the way that giving was supposed to be. It's supposed to be something we do as a community, not just as individuals. And I just wonder whether we've, within the Christian tradition, in the modern era, whether we've overemphasized those verses in the Beatitudes about not letting the right hand know what the left hand is doing when it comes to giving, and we've underemphasized those verses from the Book of Acts, which really show us a community of people involved in a shared enterprise of allowing God's good gifts to come into one hand and go out of the other as quickly as possible, allowing ourselves to be part of what I would describe as almost like a chain of grace it's like a ripple in a pond. I often say to people, the bizarre thing about grace is that we think it's free. But it is free, but just because it's free, it doesn't mean it leaves us undisturbed. When grace arrives in our lives, it's like a rock being dropped into a pond and the ripples go out. It disturbs us in a profound way. And so that's happening as God gives us day after day, week after week, his good gifts. We pass them on. And, perhaps actually that's what Jesus meant when he said, not letting the right hand know what the left hand is doing, because it's just passing through and it's flowing through us. And that's the way it's supposed to be. So, you can tell I'm really passionate about this. If you want to find out more, I've done quite a lot of work around this topic recently. I did a whole sort of study project on it last year and produced a little book off the back of that. It's not been kind of formally published, but I'll give you a link to how you can get a hold of it. And what I've just been through in the last sort of 20 minutes it will tell you much more about that, help you get under the skin of the scripture. But also a 4-part discussion resource for small groups, which you can have. That's freely available as well. You can download the PDF. And if you want to get involved in Common Change, if you want to start a group, then just drop me a line, and I'll put my email address here, and maybe developing a common fund is something that you'll find that you're able to do. Thanks for listening, and God bless.